Welcome to this edition of How I Teach, the podcast where educators share their insights and approaches on teaching important business topics. I'm your host, Mark Ranella, editor at Harvard Business Publishing. This week's topic is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a concern that every employee in a company needs to understand and take seriously. It's a dynamic discipline responding to new threats, developing daily, and brings together technical, organizational, ethical, and operational issues. What's more, inside this Rubik's Cube lies a company's well-being and reputation, which can be damaged at a moment's notice. In this episode of the podcast, Harvard Business School professor Suraj Srinivasan discusses how he teaches students how to prevent, prepare for, and respond to cybersecurity problems. Professor Srinivasan works in the Accounting and Management Department at Harvard Business School. He is currently the course head for HBS's required class on financial reporting and control, and teaches executives in leadership and corporate governance programs. He has published widely in accounting, finance, and management journals, and has written over 60 case studies. He's won awards for service and teaching innovation at HBS, and is an editor at leading accounting and management journals. Suraj, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, let's start out. What excites you about teaching cybersecurity? What do you enjoy about it?
Like you said, Mark, you can't open a newspaper, business magazine today and not read about challenges in cybersecurity, breaches at the best and largest of companies, privacy issues, data protection issues. There are policy angles, there are operational management angles, and technology angles. People are really concerned. Both at an organizational level and at an individual level. You have the threats coming from things like devices at home, smart refrigerators, as well as the good old-fashioned phishing attempts on your email and so on. So it's a very dynamic subject very important at all levels of an organization, and one that is a fast-moving. It's a very dynamic situation with both state-level actors as well as criminal actors who are part of this. So it's a fascinating field. It's fast-growing, fast-changing. And so it's really exciting to be studying this and helping people come to grips with it.
Right. It's a big subject. So why did you get started teaching cybersecurity? What brought you into the subject?
I have been always very much interested in risk management and governance in organizations. And clearly in the last 5 years, one of the biggest issues in risk management has been to deal with cyber risk. And in terms of governance, how do you organize the governance of cyber risk or cyber risk management inside an organization all the way to the level of the board, a subject that I deal with a lot and teach in several of our board governance programs. So that's where I started thinking about cybersecurity risk. I have a background in technology, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm an electronics engineer by training. Way back in the past, but
you can always use that. Right?
Yeah. So I've always been fascinated by technology issues. I also do a fair amount of technology transformation and how companies are transforming themselves in this data age. And so obviously, this fits in very well into that. This is the flip side of that coin. So I started out getting interested and learning and diving deeper into this, about 5 years back, because of the focus on risk management and technological change, and got deeper and deeper into the subject.
Right. And has your approach changed much over the last 5 years? Have you, learned while you're teaching, I need to do this, I shouldn't do that?
Certainly. I mean, I started out at a much more higher level about thinking about how this risk should be viewed at from the corporate board level. Over time, I have moved across the spectrum of that. Now, we teach this in our MBA program and all kinds of executive programs to CEOs, but also to some of my favorite teaching moments come from dealing with this topic with technologists, with chief information security officers, CTOs, and how they think about this. Because clearly, they know the technology side of things, but there's a huge organizational behavior, law, policy aspects to this, reputational aspects to this. How do you manage the organization? So the breadth of how much I've engaged with this has increased over time in a very synergistic way, because obviously The board cares about what the CISOs think. The CISOs care about what the board thinks. So you can go
Right.
back and forth in this, and that's made the experience much richer.
How interesting. Interesting. So I'm sure there's a lot of challenges to this because there's so many moving parts in this cybersecurity domain. But maybe name one or two of the biggest challenges teaching this subject.
That's a great question. Typically we rely a lot on our past experiences. You pick from best practices, you pick from what people have done in the past to identify what should be taught, and people learn from that and then implement that. In cybersecurity, the challenge is that it's very dynamic. The adversary is live, so it's not a static phenomenon. And the breaches of last year are almost certainly unlikely to repeat themselves in the future. The factors that cause them might, the organizational factors or the people factors might continue to be so, but technologically it is evolving. So that makes it very dynamic. So that's one part of it, the dynamic part of it. The second thing, as I briefly alluded to before, it's very interdisciplinary. We use paradigms from other disciplines. We use paradigms from how risk and threats are managed in other spheres. For example, OODA loop is a methodology that's used in, which was actually initially conceived of in the U.S. Air Force about how to respond quickly to threats. How should a fighter pilot respond instantaneously to new threats when they don't have the luxury of time to call back and find out, what should I do in this situation? All the way to organizational behavior and how do I structure an organization to deal with a threat of this sort and risk of this sort, as well as policy issues, privacy law. Law is moving fast to try to catch up with even faster moving technology. So it's very interdisciplinary, and that's both a challenge and an opportunity because it's really an all-encompassing field.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all the disciplines a little later, but you bring up law, and that seems like a really interesting problem because, to get, a legislature to respond seems like a huge difficulty.
You're exactly right. And it is not a threat that is geographically contained, let's say, within the United States. In fact, most of the threat for U.S. companies will come from outside of the U.S., whether it's from nation states or other organized activity. It'll come from other parts of the world. And so how do you create global consensus on issues such as privacy, on issues such as law enforcement, and how do companies that are operating in many jurisdictions deal with a U.S. multinational has to deal with GDPR in Europe. It has to deal with country-specific regulations. It has to deal with U.S. law. Within the U.S., it'll be fascinating if you are dealing with personally identifiable information, PIIs, which are one of the most frequently heard breaches that you will come to know. Pick Target or Equifax. Each state in the U.S., so there are 50 different system of laws and system of reporting requirements that one has to deal with. So it's fascinating to think about and to teach students about how to keep up and keep on top of what their legal requirements are.
It reminds me that every step forward we take also entails risk. So, when the internet first came out, you think about all this freedom and openness and possibilities of learning and connecting. Well, the negative side of that is that there's all sorts of opportunities for people to take advantage of that freedom, essentially.
We are talking about breaches specifically, or we have been talking about but a big element of what we do in the classroom is about issues around privacy. Think about everything that's happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and continues to this day with debates about the role in politics, in elections, what's the role of corporations in society, and it is really important to make this a multidisciplinary. It's not just a technology problem. It is not just a human resources problem. It is not just a threat response problem. It's not just a law problem. It's ethics and law and human behavior and technology and organizational science and so on. So it's really a field that brings it very quickly together.
You use cases mainly to teach this, not textbooks or articles. Why are cases so useful in teaching the subject?
It is, again, a great question, Mark. Articles and other material are definitely part of the portfolio that we should use in doing this. But the issues are best often understood in a very contextual fashion. You can talk about the technological aspects of file integrity monitoring or segmentation or patch protocols or encryption of personally identifiable information or certificate expiration, SSL certificate expiration, and all these things that I listed out to you come directly from my Equifax case. So it's a highly technical set of things that I talked about. How should the network be segmented? But getting into that while thinking about how target got breached makes it a very powerful way for students to contextualize it and really understand why does it matter, what are the frictions in an organization that prevent a very well-functioning, well-funded organization from actually missing some things that then lead to big catastrophic breaches. Talking about it without context actually makes it harder unless the person is highly technically sophisticated to follow along and understand what really is happening. So that's one big reason for making it contextual. The other big reason is, like I said, it is very multidisciplinary. There are a lot of gray areas, there are a lot of organizational issues. So you got to understand whether it's a legal issue, whether it's a privacy issue or ethical issue, whether it's a technical issue, in the context of some setting. It doesn't have to be necessarily a for-profit company. There are fantastic examples with breaches in the government sector, in the military, and so on. So, or in nonprofits, in education, in municipal governments, there are big problems. So putting it in the context of a case really brings it home in terms of why is this crucial and that it is important in so many different settings.
So, Suraj, you were talking about how interdisciplinary this topic is. So let's unpack it. Let's think about how you would look at cybersecurity through various disciplines. We have things like risk management or operations or organizational behavior. How would you approach it from these angles?
Excellent point. It is, as we discussed, very multidisciplinary. In fact, you can bring in literally every field of management and organizations into any one of the cases that we have that I've written. So, for example, if we pick Equifax as a example here, so one of the first topics.
Well, before we get to that, can you just describe what Equifax was about, just a little bit, just to give people a context?
Sure. So Equifax is one of the world's largest credit reporting companies. So whenever you go and fill gas or do a transaction in your bank or do anything of a financial nature or any transaction for that matter in a store, it gets reported to a reporting agency. So there are three of them primarily in the United States, and Equifax is one of the largest. It's used for developing a financial profile. Most commonly, you would have heard of the FICO score, which kind of uses the inputs from Equifax to create a credit score for an individual. So pretty much everybody in the United States and in many other countries are part of this database that Equifax and a few other companies have. Business model is to collect all this information and then provide support to lending agencies, lending companies, banks, anyone, your mortgage broker, and so on, in terms of creating a financial profile for individuals. And now, given the world is moving so much more towards data-driven decision making, somebody like Equifax gets even more important,
right?
In that to have a profile of the individual. So what happened in 2017 was that Equifax faced a giant breach. Essentially, everything that was collected was exposed to a group of outside hackers. And so the case discusses the origins of the breach, why it happened, the technical aspects of it, the organizational aspects of what happened at Equifax, their leadership structure, the structure of the information security system that they had, both the human side of it and the technical side of it, the risk management and governance processes, the strategy of the business, operations inside the business, and so on. And then ends with the legal and ethical aspects of what happened. So just using that as an example,
right?
An instructor talking about risk management and governance. What are the technical issues are, of course, central to it, but how does the technical issues impact the risk management system that you have to create inside an organization to manage a risk of this sort?
Right.
What is the governance structure that one has to create? Who should, for instance, the Chief Information Security Officer report to? Should they report inside the IT system, or should they report outside of the IT system? To give you a very simple, and this is a big debate inside organizations.
Right.
So many do it within the IT system, many don't, and the rationale for doing it within the IT system is, of course, that this is a technical issue. You need technical competence to be a Chief Information Security Officer, and you have to engage with the network and the technological assets of the company. And therefore you should be within the technology domain.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for not doing it is that in a way you're auditing and finding mistakes in the technological infrastructure of the company. So should you be reporting to the CTO, for instance, or should you be reporting outside of it to the CFO or the Chief Legal Officer, or in many cases directly to the CEO, so that important issues can get surfaced?
Right.
And that's a very deep foundational organizational design question.
Right.
So that brings me from risk management and governance to OB
Right.
kind of questions. Who is in charge of cybersecurity issues? What happens when there are too many departments that are working, should be working together, but oftentimes, as you will realize in organizations, there might be turfs that people are trying to protect. There is, decision making by committee. Another case that I have on Target, where Target is a huge, big, giant retailer in the U.S.
Right.
There were 3 separate departments that are in charge of the CFO's function, the legal function, and the technical function are dealing with this, and it almost seems like decision making by committee in that kind of situation. So what happens when there is an emergency? Who do you call? So those kinds of issues come up, and that automatically leads us to operations.
Right.
What's the process that you have to have? How do you prioritize things like patching, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
Patching is when there is a weakness in some software that, let's say, Microsoft has a version of Windows and something comes out that needs to get patched. How do you prioritize patching?
Mm-hmm.
Companies build up software packages and bring in many different over time. There's kind of legacy built into organizational computing systems.
Right.
And if you patch something in one place, it might cause something to fail in some other place. So a CTO is concerned about having the whole system function smoothly, and so maybe there is prioritization required in patching. For example, in the Equifax issue,
Right.
the whole problem came up because there was a piece of software called Apache Struts, which needed to get patched. Equifax did it in 4 days, including a weekend in the middle, but that was not fast enough because
Right.
the hackers had gotten into the system within that period of time. So there are a lot of sort of operational and design issues that are involved in that. There are, of course, strategy issues. First of all, the strategy of the organization itself. What are your key assets that are under threat? And that derives from what your strategy is and what do you want to protect? Where do you want to be in the spectrum of being secure? It is probably not even desirable that every organization get to the perfect gold standard in security, because that's extremely expensive. That's
Right.
like putting a cop on every street corner, to prevent crime. That's not the feasible or viable solution.
Right. Right.
In something like this. So what should be the strategy? And you can think about it from another point of view as a strategy professor. How do you create a business around solving cybersecurity
Right.
problem? What are the consulting or technical opportunities? Some of my students have started an insurance business to provide
really?
cyber insurance. Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
Some others have started a consulting business to help mid-tier companies. The IBMs and the largest Goldman Sachs of the world can throw resources at a problem like this. What do you do when you are a smaller company that can't throw resources at this? Talent is a big problem. How do you create cybersecurity talent?
Right.
This is one of the most prized knowledge bases to have today, is how to manage cybersecurity. And if you're in the non-for-profit sector, or if you're even in the education sector, how do you get talent which would rather go and work for a Google or a Microsoft or companies of that sort?
Right.
So how do you manage the people side of things inside an organization? And of course, we talked about the legal stuff,
Mm-hmm.
the law and privacy issues. Cyber law is an evolving field.
Right.
It's the patchwork of global regulation in that, patchwork of state level regulation in that. And so how do you manage that? What are the ethical issues? We have a course called LCA, Leadership and Corporate Accountability. They use the Equifax case in that course to think about what was the ethical and leadership responsibilities for a leader in an organization.
Right.
When you do this, what are the ethical and legal responsibilities when you are running Facebook, for instance, or if you have data on people? What was Target's legal and ethical responsibility when you have credit card information on millions of people?
And as far as ethics go, what's interesting is that what's true for these large companies is probably also true for small and medium-sized companies. These ethical considerations of how to protect data or whom to share it with and things like that.
Absolutely. And you bring up a great point. So size is definitely a critical factor, size of the organization. Larger organizations have more resources to throw at a problem, and smaller don't, but the legal and ethical responsibilities remain the same. It's also very contextual. You asked about cases earlier. It's also very contextual because what is important for a hospital and a bank might not be that salient for a different organization.
Right.
In a hospital, we've had cases where because of a cyber attack, you've had to shut down operating theaters. Emergency rooms have to be. Absolutely. I mean, Boston Children's Hospital 4 years back had a ransomware attack. How should a hospital or a medical institution deal with something like this?
Wow,
what do you do
life
if
and
you
death.
have? Absolutely.
Death,
for several days, some hospitals have had to go back to manual, paper, pencil, for record keeping and medications and things of that sort.
Wow.
So the deep sort of contextual issues, both the technical issues, organizational issues, legal, ethical issues can change depending on the industry you are in. And that's another reason to think through this in terms of cases and not in an abstract fashion.
And
then, of course, there's the reputational and the marketing angles. What are the implications, public relations and marketing impact?
The response to this, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And thinking about the legal side, there's the whole securities regulations. So if you're a public company, there are disclosure requirements that you have to deal with. And then cases like Equifax and others highlight that issue as well. How quickly do you inform your investors in capital markets? But because remember, there is a criminal element to this. So FBI gets involved very quickly. And oftentimes, your legal advisors and the FBI would tell you not to disclose things very quickly because there's a criminal element and you won't actually investigate who's behind it, what's causing it, and so on.
Right.
And so you actually cannot come out and say that this is what exactly happened because there's an investigative process that has to. It's a very challenging issue to think about in an organizational context, and therefore this idea, I feel, should be part of literally every course that's out there in some depth or the other.
Absolutely. And you touch upon an issue that came up in your cases a few times, which is the rapidity with which the company responds to this, either publicly or even within the company. Like there's a delay of 4 days to get to the CEO, for instance, even though it was a major problem. I'm just wondering, just off the top of your head, what are a couple of things that impact the decision to make it public, to raise it to the CEO or maybe take it to the FBI?
It is very, very hard in a technological sense to, first of all, know what has happened. You might suspect there's a breach. How far deep into the organization did the breach go? Was encrypted information lost? Was unencrypted information lost? How much was lost? These things take a while to figure out. But we can look at it ex post and say, oh, this took a week for you to inform. A week is a very short period of time to actually get to the bottom of, has the hacker actually left your system? Have you closed all points of exit? Now, there have been cases even in educational institutions and others where the organization found out that there was an intrusion, closed the most obvious point of where they felt the intrusion was, and thought the problem was done, and discovered later that there were 3 other points of intrusion where data was still getting lost even after they initially found it. And so it is not an easy technological problem to solve. So that's one part of it. The next is assessing the damage, assessing what the implications are. In fact, the best practice is to practice all this well in advance. Incident response planning, practice it, tabletop exercises, and in fact we have a simulation at HBP on just that.
Right.
On practicing
On cyber attack.
on a cyber attack, and how
Right.
do you respond to that?
Right.
So disaster recovery management. How do we have that in place? So both in Equifax and Target's case, that two cases that I wrote, there were 100 million plus people who have been involved with this problem. So the minute you announce this, you have to have a system in place to take calls.
Right.
So you need thousands of call center folks who are trained to respond to this issue.
Right.
You need a website to address the questions that people are going to have, and these are not things that you can't have them ready. You can't have 1,000-person call center ready at all times.
Right.
Anticipating a cyber. You got to put that in place afterwards.
Right.
And so how do you do that? We often fault companies, and oftentimes rightly so, for not being prepared.
Mm-hmm.
But even the best preparation can only take you so far.
Right.
And therefore, in fact, while teaching incident response, one of the big things that one tries to think about is, how do other incident responders do this? How do firefighters respond to a fire?
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
How do you respond to a outbreak of some infectious disease?
Right.
And how do hospitals deal with an issue of that sort? And that brings us back to the interdisciplinary nature of things,
Right.
which is there is a lot to be learned from. For instance, one of my colleagues here studies terrorist attacks. And how do you respond to something like that? How do you bring different agencies together? Same thing inside a company.
Right.
How do you bring different parts of a company together, an organization together? Not just the technical side, but the legal and the marketing and the PR and the investor relations. And so that's another very interesting element of dealing with this. There are industry level groups. The finance industry has a group. The retail industry has a group. The hospital business.
Sort of
industry.
A pool of talent or something they can.
Not to respond, but to share information. This is what happened to us. Oftentimes, you don't want to share information in a competitive setting, for obvious reasons. You don't want to give away competitive secrets.
Right.
But in a situation like this, there is an active sharing. The government has agencies and platforms that allow for sharing. Private sector has groups that allow for sharing. For example, the Massachusetts state government has a point person as a department and as a group that asks for people to share. They convene frequently, and so on. So the FBI does that as well. And this is not just in the U.S. Globally, this happens too, and to lesser degree in some places and more in other places. So how do you think about all those things and build it into your curriculum?
So Suraj, you teach this mainly to executive education courses right now, and your audience differs from course to course. How does this topic differ when you teach it to, say, technical people, CTOs, or you teach it to more general management people or people involved in governance? How does it shift from one audience to the other?
That's an excellent question. Because people come to any material, any learning experience from their particular context, from their particular perspectives. The technical people, the chief information security officers, I've taught programs with CTOs and CISOs in it, people from the IT side of things, people from the legal side of things. They bring their particular lens. They are doing it on a day-to-day basis. They see the challenges and the particular situations that they face. In those circumstances, it's very, very helpful for them, I've found, to understand the 360 degrees point of view on this. What are the challenges from the other side? How do they better integrate themselves into the rest of the organization? One of the frequent issues I've heard of from boards, for instance, or from senior executive teams, is that they get lost in the terminology and the language, that there is so much of technical jargon, quote unquote, thrown at this, that they get lost in the details. And that's a very useful message for the technical people to understand. How do we communicate this in a way that it makes sense to the rest of the organization and not just to ourselves? How do we embed the investment decisions that are involved in this in the rest of the organization? Because this is not just a technology problem. This is an organizational challenge that has to be met. This is a governance challenge that has to be met. And similarly for the rest of the folks. Why is this what is the difficulty in actually converting this highly technical material into more understandable decision-making language
For the governance people.
For the
Right.
governance people.
Right.
What should the board know about this? Because, frankly, they have to have a certain level of technical knowledge just to understand some of the basic facts, the basic issues that are involved in this. So, a lot of the training that we do for boards actually engages in that. Thinks about what are the definitions here, what are the terminologies here, what are the types of attacks, for instance. How do you identify threats? So you have to create a common dictionary.
Common vocabulary for everybody.
Common
share.
vocabulary for everybody to share.
I see.
And that is key.
Yeah, because I saw that in some of your diagrams in the cases, you were pointing out here's about 7 or 8 different kinds of attacks and how you need to know about these things.
And also threat prevention. Several things have to go wrong. Even if a bad actor enters your system, they might not be able to travel around in your system if there is enough good segmentation. Even if they get access to the data, they might not do much harm if it was all encrypted data, and so on and so forth. What are the nature and demands of network security or web security or cloud security that creates these openings for people, for breaches? And so exactly, common vocabulary and common ways of understanding the different set of issues that are coming up, and also an understanding that there are different perspectives in this, and that one has to really bring together teams to think of these issues. How do you bring together a team, and how do you engage in a team when you do this? So those are some of the very important things that you think about when you're dealing with an executive audience. And I also talked earlier about how do you structure the org, or the org structure to deal with this threat. Where should cybersecurity lie on the board? Should it lie in the audit committee? Should it lie in a risk committee? Should it lie in a more technical committee? Should there be a cyber expert, one individual who is very literate in computer science issues, or information issues that should be dealing with this? Or should it be much more broader based? Should the technical CISO be a part of the executive team in an organization?
Right.
What should be the channel of communication within an organization? So those are the kinds of issues we deal with through these cases.
Have you come across companies or organizations that are either particularly good or bad at setting a common vocabulary and common understanding? When that has become either a problem or an asset for a company.
Most of the cases that we have are problem cases. So, but I think there are, even within the problem cases, there are examples of companies and how brilliantly they've dealt with the issues. So there are good examples. There are examples of hospitals that have dealt with breaches and how they've managed to go on. And there are the other side of things, where resource constraints in municipalities and town governments and city governments that have struggled to deal with this because of resource constraints, and large companies. And the threats can come in many different fashions. One of the common ways, in fact, that we're finding now is that cyber due diligence during acquisitions becomes very important. Marriott had a large breach, not because of their own systems, but because of an acquisition that they made of another large hotel chain, and there was an existing breach in that organization, which then kind of got imported into Marriott's system because of that.
The variations of ways these things can happen is incredible.
No, you're definitely absolutely right. So those are the kinds of things. So where does the acquisition due diligence lie in an organization?
You thought M&A due diligence was hard enough, right? Now
the financial due diligence,
right.
And now you got to add this to this, and there's a whole host of companies and organizations that have gotten created to support this kind of function. There are cyber rating agencies, there are cyber consulting companies. Every large consulting business, strategy consultants, the accounting firms, all of them have dedicated cyber security advisory teams. How do you use them? How do you select between them? There are versions and versions of protection services that are offered. How does a CTO decide between one or the other. Those are the kinds of things that
It goes back to your first comment about how contextual these are. And I guess everybody has to think within their company, here's what I learned, how do I apply it to our particular circumstances?
I'll give you a great example of that. I mean, you might be a medical devices company, but what if a medical device is hacked? Because they're all connected devices now. A brilliant way of thinking about that is not just as a defensive mechanism, but how do you create a product around this? How do you help hospitals deal with this? So a medical device company that I've talked to extensively about this actually took it not as the digital security team didn't think of themselves as a support service that should be creating security, but rather they thought of themselves as a product team and created a product around security that it's become a great hit for them, that they are now successfully embedding into their products, into others' products, into hospitals, and actually making it a revenue stream rather than just a defensive thing. So how do they not create problems, and how do you even take it one step further and solve other problems? Because now we've developed know-how on solving these things, solving these kinds of this genre of problems. How do we then take it into other parts and not just in our products, in other parts of the business?
Right.
And so how, that's the strategy part of it. How do you now take the opportunity and that your resources now offer you, and convert that into a business opportunity itself? There's lots of interesting things in that context. So in an executive program, you can surface all these issues.
So Suraj, if you could teach a whole course on this topic, on cybersecurity at the graduate level, how would the course open up, and how would it evolve over the semester?
That would be a dream. That'll be a dream course. I think that'll be a wonderful course. I would really encourage anyone listening to this to consider that, because one, it'll be a very successful course, I think, and I think it's a very needed course to really bring in many different aspects of the issue and give people a holistic sense of what is involved in managing cybersecurity.
Right.
So I mean, here's a way. I mean, I tend to think of courses in modules.
Okay.
Because and how modules fit into each other, and different courses might weight a module in some form, in more or less, depending upon the particular context in which it's being used. For instance, an MBA course might do it a little differently from if you're doing this in a information systems program in a more technical set of students.
Right.
But broadly speaking, these are the modules I would go through, and I'll then dig a little deeper into the modules themselves.
Great.
I would start with more the sort of the engineering technical aspect of things, to set up the vocabulary, to set up what it is that we're talking about.
That's the key beginning there.
Right. And again, you can dig as much as deep or not, but it's important to set get the basics of that in. So there's the engineering and the network part of the technical content, and then there's the threat and the breaches part of the technical content. So I would maybe start with the information security module, move into a breaches threat identification module, and so in these, what would I do? So then in the engineering information security, we would think about things like, what is network security, what is web security, what are the operational things that you need to do in cybersecurity, patching, endpoint protection, encryption. What are the details about server and user administration, authentication, access control? What is cryptography, and what are the kinds of database vulnerabilities and cloud security and so on? And so think about this as the technology of information security. Very closely related to that, and as the next module, get into the breaches themselves. What are the different types of threats? What are the different types of attacks? Develop that vocabulary. What is the DDoS? What is the ransomware? What are the terminologies and definitions here? And that leads to implementing a mitigation strategy. And also about emerging and future threats. The same thing that happened yesterday is not going to happen tomorrow. How do you get a sense for what's coming around the bend? How do you look ahead in a situation like this? So this would probably be the first third of a course. Right. And the breaches part then naturally lends itself into a third module, which is what I would broadly call the management issues and the cybersecurity governance. What is risk management here? What are the risk management fundamentals? What are the key assets and systems to be protected? How do I prioritize that? How do we figure out what our cyber security profile should be? Should it be a 5-star? Should it be 3-star? Should it be 1-star? I mean, and if you are at 1-star today, what are the kind of investment that is needed to go to 2 and 3? Do we want to jump from 1 to 5-star? And what are the kind of investment? I would suggest that in most cases that is not necessary. You need to go step by step and invest and learn along with the way. So what are the kind of the management and leadership issues around cybersecurity? What are the training? How do you create a culture of security in an organization? How do you meet compliance standards?
Right.
NIST, GDPR, PCI, and so many others. So that's kind of the third module. I would do a full module on how do you deal with a breach. How do you put resources together? What is incident response planning? How do you execute on incident response? How do you do disaster recovery? How do you do fraud examination? How do you do litigation support? So that's the post-breach response side. And I would close with the big picture, the law and policy and ethical issues regarding this. What are the different legal settings that we need to understand here? GDPR in Europe, US regulations, state level regulations. So what is cybersecurity law and policy? What are the compliance and legal issues? How do you deal with nation state versus criminal actors? What are the policy issues in each of these? What are data privacy issues? Taking Facebook as an example. What are the ethical issues? What are the ethical responsibilities of a corporation to society, to its customers, to its investors, to its employees? How do you think about all those things? So, broadly speaking, I would put it in these 5 modules. In the last module, I would also think about disclosure issues, corporate disclosure issues, how to deal with law enforcement issues in this.
So these are more the more traditional business risk management or risk mitigation or risk reaction issues applied to cybersecurity.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So start with the more technical content, move into the organizational issues, and then combine the organizational with the technical issues in the post-breach response, and then end with the big picture law, ethics, policy kind of questions.
Excellent. And you were talking about how some good companies are well prepared. Where does that preparation part fit in here?
In the middle.
In the middle.
Somewhere. For example, I mean that would be the incident response planning. How do we practice this? What do we practice? So there are 2 levels of that a course like this can you can approach it. One is the kind of the foundational ideas, the frameworks that one needs to use. The second is the practical nature of things. And as a framework, you understand that you should be able to assemble a team quickly. Right. The practical nature of that, let me give you a very interesting example. Most times when people assemble these kits on how to manage a post-breach response, guess where that kit was saved? On your computer.
Right.
And in a breach situation, the computer is gone. It's hacked. So you can't access your machine. You can't access the network when that happens. So you need to have a binder.
Right.
And you have to have a binder at home because this might happen on a Saturday night, or you need to find a way. How do I call the CEO when the CEO, he or she, is on a flight somewhere, or the CFO is on a vacation? So those are the very tactical nature.
Right.
So one is the larger picture framework kind of issues. What is the idea behind an OODA loop, or what are the idea behind NIST, and how NIST is the National Standards Institute that has created a set of standards for cybersecurity. But what is the theoretical basis for that, and then what are the practical things that you need to do? And different courses might weight these differently.
I could imagine being in a course and bringing in a binder and saying, this is your last firewall against cybersecurity attacks.
Companies that are really on top of this have little like laminated index card kind of things that you literally keep on the back of your badge,
Right.
or in your coat pocket, because the laminated card has the personal cell phone numbers of all the people that need to get contacted in a situation like this.
Right.
And these are getting adapted for the cyber situation. Like you said, I mean, many of these are traditional risk management ideas, but how do you then take it and move it into the cyber? So back to the course, depending upon whether this is a graduate level information systems course, or information system students, or an MBA course. Let's think of an MBA course, for instance. In an MBA course, I might actually spend a reasonable amount of time helping people into the getting really to understand the issues with security and network systems and so on, because they might not be like an information systems student who actually just knows that from other contexts.
Right.
So might actually spend a little more time on that and build on other courses that you have done in OB and risk management and strategy, and draw from those other courses and pull into this, and almost use this in a way as an elective, almost capstone kind of a course.
Right, where you have to bring all your skills
that
to
you have
bear,
seen,
right.
that you have learned in your first year or in other parts of your learning, and bringing that together in cases of this sort. Whereas in an undergraduate program, I might spend an equal amount of time on these different issues,
right.
And know that you don't have the benefit of other knowledge in organizational design or in law and ethics that students need to have. In a law program, I might spend more time on organizational issues and draw on the other knowledge students have in law and build on that, rather than approach the basics. And obviously the different instructors will curate their own courses, knowing what their student audience is going to look like.
Right.
But there is enough in each of these modules to expand or contract.
Just to wrap up, I'm curious to get some insights about your actual classroom experience or discussions, and just thinking about, when you approach an executive ed class and you have a typical classroom, what might be some misconceptions or ideas that you have to overcome about cybersecurity to teach it well?
Several. It's a very interesting thing, as no doubt I hope you have conveyed through the rest of this podcast. There's so many different things that it is often revealing to people how multidimensional this is. So I won't call this a misconception. It is just an awareness that people develop that actually a lot of things have to happen well to do this well. Also, that the bad actors have to get it right once. You have to get it right every time.
Right.
There is no silver bullet. That probably is a misconception. Sometimes there's a misconception that this is a technological problem, and we have just not invested enough, or that we just don't have the right tools to solve this.
Right.
This is not just a technological problem. And even technology is put in place by human beings, by
Right.
people in the organization. Equifax, putting in all the money, had all the tools, but still the mistake, the breach happened. So understanding that it is not just a technology problem, you can't just throw money at it. It is a highly disciplined effort from the entire organization is what is needed. Often becomes an aha here. There are a lot of interesting moments because, especially in executive education, but I've seen this in MBA classroom as well. Unfortunately, we all have a lot of experience with breaches.
Right. Personal and professional, right.
Personal and professional.
Right.
And so actually that makes it interesting. Even though, I don't know, I have myself gotten now at least 5-6 times credit card companies telling me that my card has been stolen or hacked, because some retailer lost information. As distressing or inconvenient that is, we all have our experiences with this. So one of the exciting things that happen in this kind of classes is that there's a lot of experience sharing, especially when there are executives or board members. There's a lot of experience sharing on good practices, things that have worked well, things that they wish they had done. I end up learning a lot, and I bet any instructor that teaches this is going to feel that way as well. That makes courses extremely lively and the material extremely interesting, because you can keep learning from this, and obviously the classroom learns as well. You hear of so many interesting stories. And one of the important things that anyone will teach in how threats are propagated is this thing called spear phishing. I heard of this example of, and there was a CFO of this large bank on the first morning when they became the CFO. And this, you really have to be following that company to know that this transition happened, and it happened that morning.
Right.
Got an email purportedly from their CEO, which asked them to urgently issue a $3 million payment for this vendor who had been waiting for it, and it's very important, and so on. And they were about to do it. As chance would have it, just happened to step out to get a drink of water. The CEO happened to step out at that same time, and they met each other in the hallway, and the CFO said, "Just getting to it, 5 minutes, it'll be done." And the CEO was like, "Done? What done? Like,
What's
what are
done?
you talking? Yeah, what are you talking about?" And they said, "Didn't you send me this email this morning?" He said, "What email?" By the way, this kind of payment fraud is one of the biggest things. The FBI actually put out a release about several months ago saying payment fraud is a big threat. Fake invoices and fake approvals that are making accounts payable people are then paying them.
Right.
And this example, and that made it an opportunity for others to share and then think about why this might have happened. How do you prevent this? How do you systematically set up a mechanism so that something like this doesn't happen inside organizations? So a lot of the discoveries are made during the discussion.
Right.
And that is fascinating for people. Everybody has their favorite story where they got fished
Right.
for some information. Personal stories and professional stories. So, and I get emails after that from people. I didn't want to share this in a public setting, but I have this interesting thing to tell you. Where this happened in my organization. A lot of case examples come up. A lot of stories that you can use for another setting.
Right.
But these are not just stories. There are systematic threads among these different examples which connect with where you've been in the course or in that particular case.
So are you looking ahead to any particular issues or cases that are really interesting for you that you'd like to work on next?
Definitely. I'm working on a few different things. One somewhat bigger project is I'm looking at the top 20 or so breaches in the last year across the world and trying to draw out common technological and organizational lessons that we can learn from them. The technology part, because the speed of technology changes in hacking attacks changes, it's not purely what happened yesterday, but it's more about why did we miss it and what was in the organizational design or in our own learning or understanding of the protocols in the company that missed it, and then try to develop some meta-knowledge, and hopefully that article will be out soon. The other couple of big areas to think about in this is what do you do in the context of a breach? We're working with a couple of hospitals in writing that. How do you respond in real time? Put people in the shoes of the incident responders in this case, all the way from the CEOs down,
right.
and then help them think through this. And this is the nature of the simulation that HPP has as well. But how do you create these best practices? How do you how do you enable kind of situations where the organization knows exactly what's the right thing to do when they are hit with a crisis? How do you create that in advance?
Right.
And then there are other sort of a little more specific issues depending upon the kind of industry you are in. How do you manage this threat when you are a smaller sized organization? That really fascinates me. How do you manage this threat in the absence of resources or when you're resource constrained? So if you are a state or a city municipal government, or if you are a public school system, or even a university, how do you deal with the talent issues and the investment issues that are needed for this, and create your own what works for you, which might not be what works for Goldman Sachs or even Target and Equifax.
This just makes me think that HBS could be really well prepared to deal with these things, because one of the big challenges of leadership is making decisions under pressure, also with limited information. So, and this requires that. And it seems like it's a great leadership venue to sort of think about leadership trade-offs and
by definition, this is a place where prioritization, trade-offs, decision making under stress, taking the organization with you, making decisions when you don't know what the right answer is, and oftentimes don't even have all the information on what has actually happened. How do you train for that? How do you decide under the glare of public scrutiny, and ensure the organization comes out good, does right by all the different stakeholders?
Right.
There are public stakeholders. There is the society as a stakeholder. There are bystanders in a way. I mean, when Equifax happens, all of us are bystanders whose data just got exposed so what is the right thing for them to do?
Right.
Absolutely. I think it's a great leadership learning moment to think through.
It seems like, just like you were talking about, there's strategic opportunities. There are teaching opportunities that are quite broad as well as specific. And it seems like a really rich area to keep on plowing for educational purposes.
And that's my plan, at least for myself, is to exactly do that, because you can go as broad as you want and you can go as deep as you want. The ethics and policy issues become broad. The industry-specific challenges, product-specific challenges become deep. The training and human challenges become deep, and therefore it gives allows for a lot of interesting courses that can play on these two dimensions, the depth versus the breadth, depending on the kind of students that you are trying to engage with.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure your students will enjoy whatever course you come up with, either the breadth or the depth of it, and I certainly have appreciated all your insights. So thank you very much, Suraj, for talking about cybersecurity.
It was my pleasure. This is a fascinating topic, and something that's really, really important for countries, organizations, companies, and individuals. So at every level is very important. So I really would urge all of us to be thinking about these issues and to be creating courses about these. Thank you.